Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. For those that don't know me, I'm Toby Young. I'm the founder and general secretary of the Free Speech Union. And this, I think, is our largest ever event. So thank you for helping make that possible. Thank you. We're here to celebrate the publication of a book called The War on Science, which has been edited by Lawrence Krauss, who I'm going to bring out in a second. And I should say that in addition to all his other distinctions, Lawrence, of course, is a famous astrophysicist, former professor at Yale, and an amazingly distinguished academic career. In addition to all of that, he's the chairman of the Free Speech Union of Canada. So he's now part of the international Free Speech Union movement. So I'm particularly pleased that we were able to have this event tonight and launch his book and have a panel discussion up here on stage. And I should say, a particular thanks to Trailfinders, the travel company, for helping to make this event possible. There will be, thank you, Trailfinders. And I'll just quickly run you through it. So I'm going to bring out Lawrence in a second. I'm going to ask Lawrence to tell us a bit about the book, and then we're going to bring out Richard Dawkins, Alice Sullivan, John Armstrong, Alan Sokal, and Amy Wax, all of whom are contributors to the book. It's really a collection of essays. And we're going to have a panel discussion led by Lawrence. Let's bring out Lawrence Krauss, the editor of The War on Science. Do you want to tell us a bit about The War on Science?
Well, there are a few wars on science going on right now, and the book was written over the last year in 2024 because universities and, in this case, government institutions and industry are changing. Universities should be the place, if any place in society should have free speech, open debate, open questioning, it should be universities. And if I once wrote that the purpose of education is to make us uncomfortable. And that now, in many places, is viewed as an anathema. Being uncomfortable is inappropriate. And it's not just in universities, it's in research journals and elsewhere. The examples of this are manifest, and I can talk about a few of them. But it's meaning that not just the humanities, where a lot of this began, but science, my own field, is being affected. In the 1980s, when I taught at Yale, we used to laugh at the English department down the hill, which was full of what was called deconstructionism at the time, which is based on the idea that there's no objective knowledge and all knowledge is based on power structures and oppression. And we said it can't happen here. And in 1996, Alan Sokal, who will be coming out here, produced a famous spoof paper, which went in the journal Social Choice. And I always have to remember the name of it because it's so ridiculous. It was called Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. And it was gobbledygook. And let me read a little bit of the gobbledygook, because at the time it seemed like who could believe this stuff? But it may begin to seem a little more familiar to some of you. Here's a quote from it. Most recently, feminist and post-structuralist critiques have demystified the substantive content of mainstream Western scientific practice, revealing the ideology of domination concealed behind the facade of objectivity. And reality, no less than social reality, is at a bottom a social and linguistic construct. The scientific community cannot assert a privileged epistemological status with respect to counter-hegemonic narratives emanating from dissident or marginalized communities. And it just, and in any case, and they argued that quantum gravity was all part of this. And then after it came out, he announced it was a spoof, and it was on the front page of the New York Times, you may remember, and it was a big deal. Fast forward 30 years. Here's the Journal of Chemical Education, published an article entitled A Special Topics Class in Chemistry on Feminism and Science as a Tool to Disrupt the Disconscious Racism in STEM. And I'll read a quote from here too, it may seem familiar. This article presents an argument on the importance of teaching science with a feminist framework and defines it by acknowledging that all knowledge is historically situated and influenced by social and power politics. I particularly like this quote. This course will explore the development and interrelationship between quantum mechanics, Marxist materialism, Afrofuturist pessimism, and post-colonial nationalism. Okay? My own field of physics, the American Physical Society, publishes a journal called the Physical Review, which is the dominant physical journal. It published an article called Observing Whiteness in Introductory Physics, in which it argued that, among other things, whiteboards, let me read it. Entangled with the above is the use of whiteboards as a primary pedagogical tool. They also play a role in reconstituting whiteness as social organization. They collaborate with white organizational culture where ideas and experiments gain value when written down, which is bad, especially on a whiteboard. Now, that's the absurdness of postmodernism in science, but it's much worse. It's gotten much worse. The policing of free speech is incredible, and the incursion of ideology into not just universities, but to scientific institutions, academic institutions, and government is amazing. I'll give one or two more examples. My own field, again, starting with the American Physical Society, amazed me in 2020 after George Floyd. The APS sent out a letter to their membership arguing that a presidential executive order produced at the time by Donald Trump was, quote, in direct opposition to the core values of the American Physical Society. What did that order, they said it needed to be rescinded in order to strengthen America's scientific enterprise. The order stated that in government-supported scientific institutions, people should be judged, quote, not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And it further argued that materials in places like Argonne National Laboratory that equate colorblindness and meritocracy with actions of bias, or ones that put an emphasis of rationality over emotionality, is a characteristic of white males. Okay, so the point is that the executive order argued that people should be judged on merit. And the American Physical Society said that's an anathema. That's against the fundamental principles of the American Physical Society and necessary to be rescinded for science to progress. It's just ridiculous. There was a meeting in astrobiology, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, where they decided to remove the word intelligence because it was a white construct. And this was taken over by government officials. Francis Collins, who is someone I knew and a former friend, he was the head of the National Institutes of Health for many years. After George Floyd, he announced that the biomedical research community in the United States was systemically racist, and they had to do something about it. Now, this is the kind of virtue signaling that needs to be attacked as well, because clearly, if he really believed what he said, he should resign. He should have resigned. He was the head of that organization for 15 years. If he believed it was systemically racist, he had been the head of it. But people, and you'll see leaders, especially of academic institutions and scientific institutions, speaking out with this virtue signaling about things they don't believe. And part of the real problem is that academic leaders have lost backbone to address any of this. I'll give one more example, and then I'll say the context of the book, and then we can proceed. But this has also gone into scientific journals. The Royal Society of Chemistry and Nature Behavior both announced in different ways that they would not publish articles that might offend anyone, regardless of whether they were scientifically correct, because doing so would cause harm. Now, one can go back, since we're in England, into the Royal Society, and I think 1671, Anton von Leeuwenhoek, and I'm sure I'm bastardizing his name, who invented the microscope, discovered spermatozoa and submitted an article to the Royal Society on that and said to the president of the Royal Society, if this is too offensive, don't publish it, basically. And the Royal Society published it. Okay? So what we're advocating is that we go back to the good old days of 1670, where people can actually publish results that are correct, and offense doesn't matter. Now, how can you counter this? There is great fear in that. First of all, many academics don't have academics in general try and stay below the radar. They just don't want to do their own stuff. And many of them are ignorant about what's going on. Others are afraid. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about the incursion of ideology in science in, I think, 2020. And I got letters from academics around the country, all of them from their home computers, not a single institutional computer, and 6 of them using fake names because they specifically said they were afraid that administrators or their colleagues would find out. That's like the Soviet Union or Hungary or East Berlin. That happens in academia is a huge, huge problem that we need to fight, and it's not going away. At the same time, it's worth pointing out, especially, well, before I get there, how to counter that? Well, one way, it seemed to me, was to get a group of distinguished academics to speak out, because many faculty are clearly afraid of speaking out. And I think one of the ways we can change this, I think perhaps the only way it'll change in academia, is if faculty finally speak out and say this is unacceptable. So I thought of trying to put together a group of people, sufficient distinction that other people wouldn't be afraid of speaking out. At the same time, I wanted to make sure that this group was diverse in the senses that are important. First, I wanted them to represent as many different academic disciplines as possible, to talk about what was going on in their fields or experiences of colleagues who've been canceled, efforts to replace merit with identity, and so I looked and sought out a group of people, and put together. I'm very pleased with the 38 other authors. I was really pleased, and the people who are going to be on this stage, I'm very thankful that they agreed to take their time and write pieces on this. The other thing I wanted to do, because I was certain that this would be attacked as a right-wing diatribe, I wanted to also get people who were well known to be politically diverse. People, let's say Richard Dawkins or Steve Pinker on one side, and the other side maybe Jordan Peterson. And so that it wouldn't be necessary. Of course, it has been attacked as a right-wing diatribe anyway. But this group of people represents a broad consensus. And I also, because I believe in academic freedom, I didn't ask the authors I didn't tell them what to write. I said, you pick the issue that you think is most important. And it came together remarkably well, each of them talking about their own experiences. And if you read it, you wouldn't believe some of the things that are happening. And it is, why should we care about this? Because, well, in my science, first, is central to the progress of our society. Academic freedom is an essential part of education. And if we give up free speech in universities and the right to debate, the right to cause offense, then scholarship ends and science ends. And we've seen other examples of it. We've seen places where ideology has replaced scholarship. And one example, Neil Ferguson, who's not here, talked about Nazi Germany, where the best universities in the world, Berlin, Heidelberg, quickly became marginal because, of course, Jewish academics were removed. We risk, certainly in the West, doing the same thing unless we stand by the principles that are important, and they're important for the progress of society, the health and welfare of human beings, and democracy. So that was the idea behind producing this volume, and I'm, again, very thankful to the people, some of whom you'll meet here who are on it.
Should we bring them out?
Let's bring them out.
So we have John Armstrong. You're right on the end there, John. And Alice Sullivan. Amy Wax, you're just right here, Amy. and Alan Sokal, and Richard Dawkins. So, Lawrence, do you want to ask each of them to talk a little bit about their chapters?
Yeah, certainly, of course. We'll start with Richard. I actually have two questions for you. But you began your piece talking about Lysenko. Why?
Lysenko is a cautionary tale from Soviet Russia. He was a charlatan. He was a so-called agricultural scientist who ruined Soviet agriculture by his crackpot theories, which were Lamarckian. Unfortunately, he got the ear of Stalin, I think because his Lamarckism chimed in with Marxist orthodoxy. And so he eventually ended up being placed in charge of the whole of Soviet agricultural research. And as a direct consequence of his charlatanry, there were great famines both in Russia and China. There's a volume called The Situation in Biological Science, a nice innocuous title, which was edited by him. It was the proceedings of a conference in Moscow in 1948, where one after another the delegates stood up and rubbished what they called Mendelist Morganism, which is genetics, and praising a form of Lamarckism. And it's just pure political propaganda. This is a textbook example of what happens when politics is allowed to take over and dominate scientific truth. At the end of the conference, there was a rather pathetic scenes where delegates, geneticists, agriculturalists, biologists stood up and confessed their sins and were presumably led off to the gulag. I mean, we don't quite know what. We know that a lot of them were, in fact, killed or imprisoned because of their heretical views. This is a cautionary tale for what can happen when politics is allowed to dominate science.
You know, I'll just say, it sounds like, again, it couldn't happen here. There was a very famous astronomer who recently wrote a paper which was for the National Academy of Sciences, which was rescinded, and he wrote a very Maoist apology for offending people. It was trying to use metrics to determine, rigorous metrics to determine which young people might succeed using various quantitative factors, and people viewed that as racist. And he had to remove the article, remove the book, and write a long apology for having tried to help the field. It was very similar. Now, the next part of your piece, for which you've received a lot of attention here already, is about a remarkable claim of yours that there are just two sexes. And I wanted you give a brief summary of that.
Well, for the last 2 billion years, there have been just two sexes. And then suddenly, within the last 10 years or so, a whole lot more started to get invented. Yes, well, lots of other people will be talking about this. I am a biologist, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and every single paper that you read about animal behavior, evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, in the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom simply takes the two sexes for granted. And by the way, so do all the biologists who allegedly believe that there's a spectrum of sexes. When they actually do their biology, when they actually do their research, of course they simply talk about males and females. They know what the difference is. It's not that difficult, actually. And so, yes, the second part of my essay is an account of this. It talks about the biological criterion for sex differences, which is anisogamy, the difference between large macrogametes over eggs and small microgametes, which is universal throughout the animal and plant kingdoms. The only exceptions are in fungi and some algae. And there's good mathematical modeling to explain why anisogamy is stable, why anisogamy is favored by natural selection. Isogamy, the equal sexes, equal gametes, where you have two equal-sized gametes, does exist in a few things like algae and fungi, and there are good mathematical models showing how this is unstable, and you get a runaway selection towards anisogamy, where you have this large gametes and small gametes. That's the definition, the biological definition of sex differences. In practice, sex differences are determined in various different ways in different parts of the animal kingdom, like chromosomes in some places, chromosomes in mammals, chromosomes in birds, the opposite way round. In birds and Lepidoptera, it's the male which is the heterogametic sex. In mammals and many other animals, it's the other way around. In birds and Lepidoptera, it's the females. In mammals, it's the male. In some reptiles, it's done by temperature. So that's very variable, but the fundamental sex divide, the fundamental binary is this anisogamy, the difference between the large gametes and small gametes. That is universal. There are no exceptions to that. There are no intermediates.
You'd think that wouldn't be controversial, but of course it is. And I'm going to talk to Alice in a second about some of the ways that manifests itself in the academic community. But once again, just to give an example of how it's permeated diversely, many different fields. One of the authors, who's not here, Elizabeth Weiss, had a panel at the American Anthropological Society talking about the sex of skeletons, of ancient skeletons, which is a kind of important thing to know if you're trying to do anthropology of societies and you uncover skeletons. But the American Anthropological Society said again that determining sex of skeletons causes harm, and they removed the article. They removed the whole session from their meeting because the idea that you could determine the sex of skeletons was something that was A, doable, and B, a good thing. I mean, it's just amazing. But what Alice has written and actively done a lot for, and in this country, and she's working very hard on your behalf, is what the article you wrote is about sex, gender identity, and particularly the suppression of discussing that, even stating something that Richard said, or just having that conversation, much less making the claim. And so I wanted you to elaborate on the kind of things that are going on to suppress discussion, just simple discussion of that. And then maybe you might want to mention the very important government-sponsored commission report that you wrote on just that subject.
Thank you. When I first started talking about this, I was very concerned about our ability to collect data on sex. And I organised an open letter to the UK census authorities because they were considering at the time changing the guidance for the sex question in the 2021 census, so that although it would still be the same question, people would be told that they could answer it not in terms of their sex, but in terms of their identity, if that was different from their sex. And I was pleased to be invited to talk at an event on sex and gender and data collection that was organised by the National Centre for Social Research and with the Office for National Statistics involved. And then the event was mysteriously cancelled. And I kind of suspected, hang on a minute, this is a bit odd. The letter I got saying the event was cancelled said it was cancelled because people were very interested in the topic. And I thought it's a little bit strange. So I kind of smelled a rat and I challenged them and I said, look, you've cancelled it because you didn't want to platform me. And they admitted that was what it was. And I put in something called a subject access request, which is where you can find out what people have been saying about you behind your back. And it turned out that they had thought that by just cancelling the whole thing, I wouldn't realise I'd been no platformed, which obviously that didn't work. But that was my first realisation that it wasn't only that we're not able to collect data on sex, we're not even able to talk about collecting data on sex, and how deep this had gone into academia, because I knew there was crazy stuff going on in certain academic departments. The idea that this had got into the Office for National Statistics and into data collection was really scary to me. I had not realized how deep it had gone in.
Do you want to talk about a few examples, including what's happened to you for speaking out about this, right? I mean, what were some examples of people who've been deplatformed or otherwise canceled or ostracized in the academic community for speaking out at all?
I mean, there are so many examples, and some of them are very prominent examples, like Kathleen Stock, of course, who was hounded out of her job at the University of Sussex. But I think there are many more sort of less visible examples, and the recent review that I did for government was in two parts. So the first report was on data collection and the way that we've been losing data on sex across the system. The second part was on barriers to research, and I did an open call for evidence so that people could tell their stories, academics could tell their stories of what had happened to them. And many of those stories are not necessarily about the sort of dramatic houndings that we hear about, but people, in some cases, simply seeing that happen to other people and thinking, I do not want that to happen to me, and therefore not speaking and not doing things that they would like to do. In other cases, it's about the bureaucratic hurdles that we have so many of in universities now. You know, you need to go through an ethics committee, you need to, if you want to organize an event, it has to go through a risk assessment, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very easy for activists to get into all of those systems, so that we see examples like people not being able to collect data on sex because an ethics committee or somebody on an ethics committee decides that that constitutes some form of misgendering, which of course is verboten.
Now you wrote this government commission report. What's the response been?
So the first report on data, I think the response has been really positive. Everybody agrees with me, and yet it's very hard to get anything done about it. So nobody is turning around and saying that I'm wrong. And I was very pleased that Wes Streeting, the health secretary, actually immediately on the day that my report was published, acted to stop minors from being able to have their what's called their gender marker, really the sex marker in their National Health Service records changed. And I was really relieved about that, because that was a huge safeguarding issue where I discovered that even some infants had had their gender markers changed, not for any medical reason, but simply because a parent wanted it. And when it was raised as a safeguarding issue, it was not treated appropriately, because of course gender is treated as something different from you know, people forget all their normal professional standards when it comes to gender. So I was delighted that that happened, but I think this is so deeply embedded across so many systems that people keep asking me, oh, what are you going to do next? As though this is all like sorted out now. But I think it's going to take a while to actually go through the weeds of this and dig it out of all the places where it is and restore sex-based data collection. And I've said throughout this, by the way, that I think we should collect data on sex, and I think we should collect data on transgender identities. I think that's a really important and useful thing to find out about people. But they're different things, and muddling together does not give us good data on either of those.
And I would, yeah.
The CAS report is, from the other side of the Atlantic, we look longingly at I mean, it really was a big deal and a significant But do you think, has it allowed, at least when it comes to gender affirming care, has it allowed people to speak up more now that the government has affirmed that there's no evidence that it's medically necessary?
I think the Cass report really vindicates many of the early whistleblowers and academics who were really hounded. So women like Michelle Moore, who was driven out of her career. You know, she had a background in disability studies, and she was hearing this idea that people were born in the wrong body, and it just, she thought, hang on, there's something wrong here, and she spoke out about it. Women like that, and also the medical whistleblowers, have been absolutely vindicated by Cass, because it simply says the data have not been collected. The evidence has not been gathered. This has been treated, it's a novel treatment, and yet we've been handing this out to children without the evidence being there. And that's, you couldn't have a more dramatic example of why it matters that people are able to have open discussions, to collect data, to publish scientific research. Because if we don't, then vulnerable people suffer the most.
Thank you. And that'll be relevant for Amy, who's going to talk about, in some sense, the situation in the medical community in the United States, where you would die to have a report like the Cass report, which actually references data. But we'll get to there in a second. First, we're going to move, again, a trigger warning. This panel is not completely diverse. We have two mathematicians, and I want to go to the first. I want to go to John Armstrong, who the title of your piece is "How Do You Decolonize Mathematics?" And that's an interesting question. And what is amazing is that, well, first you can ask the question, what the hell does that mean? And I know you spent some time in your piece trying to talk about that, so begin with that. But it actually relates to an amazing piece in Nature, of all places, on this obvious bit of nonsense. So why don't you go on?
Yeah, thank you for that. So yes, to answer the question of what it means to decolonize mathematics, I mean, I've had the misfortune to read the entire literature on decolonizing maths. So it's not enormous, it's about 40 papers. So I did a systematic literature review and read every paper on this. And the reason I did that was because of this pressure that we've experienced in science, that we must all decolonize science. So as Lawrence mentions, for example, Nature has written an editorial saying we have a sort of moral need as a result of Black Lives Matter to decolonize all of science. And in the UK, mathematicians have been told that in our undergraduate curriculum we have to teach from a decolonial perspective. They changed that slightly, but that's still the same gist. Anyway, so I've read the literature, and I can basically give an answer that to decolonize mathematics, the central theme is to give equal priority to other ways of knowing as being on a par of mathematics. So I can give you an extreme example of what that means. I attended a talk organised by the London Mathematical Society, and it was argued there that we should be open to the idea that there are other ways of knowing where 2 + 2 might equal 5. When I was there, nobody laughed at the London Mathematical Society. Also, at the same sort of extreme end of what it might mean to decolonize mathematics, you've got the academic theory of decoloniality, and so that was created by the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, and he describes it himself as a critique of the European paradigm of rational knowledge. Now, to state the absolutely obvious, there's nothing particularly rational about Europeans. Well, unless maybe you compare them with Canadians. Now, Quijano himself didn't talk directly about maths, but you can see similar themes in the work of a guy called Bishop, who is the most highly cited author in my review. And his paper was called Western Mathematics, the Secret Weapon of Cultural Imperialism. He argues that rationality, abstraction, power and control and progress, they're all defining features of Western mathematics, and that by promoting these values, mathematics promotes Western cultural hegemony. So the problem with all of this is that maths is universal. Postmodernists think that all knowledge is a cultural construct, but frankly, maths proves they're wrong. So, as an example for that, the same formula for pi was discovered by Madhava in Kerala, Gregory in Scotland, and Leibniz in Germany, all independently. The concept of zero was discovered by the Babylonians, the Indians, and the Maya, also independently. There's nothing Western about mathematics at all. Euclid did his geometry in North Africa. As the name suggests, Arabic numbers are not actually Western. Algebra is named after a book by the Persian mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, from whose name we get the word algorithm. So that's the theory side of decolonizing maths, but what does it mean in practice? Well, it seems to mean one of three things. So one option is to use maths teaching to promote social justice. And that's the approach of Marilyn Frankenstein. I didn't make up her name. She's the creator of critical mathematics pedagogy. And she recommends that we teach maths. Well, we need to change the way we teach maths, because even trivial math applications, like totaling grocery bills, carry the ideological message that paying for food is natural. So another way you could try and decolonize your mathematical curriculum is to teach in a way that appeals more to indigenous students. So, for example, one paper I read talked about a module called wigwametry, and that uses TP construction as a way to learn about pi. Now, some of you may think that's a little bit patronizing. And I'd like to read to you what one scholar said. So, Sterenberg repeated an insulting word problem. Imagine a band of 250 Aboriginal people. Each teepee can hold approximately 8 people. Calculate how many teepees would be needed to house the entire band. This is insulting, she says, because indigenous people would not divide themselves in the hypothetical way stated in the word problem. Relational and spiritual factors would dominate, and the required hypothetical state of mind itself captured in the word imagine is a value embraced strongly in the culture of school mathematics, but would generally be foreign to an indigenous culture in the context of people choosing a teepee to enter because it conflicts with how to live in a good way. Now, in the UK, decolonising maths seems to mean teaching a distorted version of history. So very specifically, maths university lectures have been told by the Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education that we need to teach that some mathematicians were Nazis, but we are not told that we must teach that some of them were Jews persecuted by the Nazis. In fact, the whole literature on decolonising maths seems to ignore the enormous contributions of Jews entirely. I was talking to one student about the oddity that we're all told that it's racist to call the Chinese remainder theorem Chinese, but nobody complains about people calling Polish spaces Polish. And the student explained to me that the difference here is that Polish people have not been historically marginalized in the same way as the Chinese. Now, in fairness to the student, when I pointed out that 4.5 million Poles were killed by the Nazis, they accepted that, and I don't have any beef at all with our students. A lot of my colleagues complain about how little students know, but I always think that they should ask themselves, who's to blame for that? So the problem for me with decolonising maths is that it promotes a false and racist view of history in order to justify the false and racist view that non-Europeans are less rational and less capable of abstract reasoning. But apart from that, I'm all for it.
Just to show that things can get more ridiculous, I guess. You're aware of this California initiative, this math curriculum that was developed in California, which indicated that that math was inherently white supremacist and should be taught differently. That getting the right answer, for example, was an example of white supremacy, and showing your work was another example. And this was a white paper put together by the state of California, the Gates Foundation, and a group associated with Lawrence Berkeley Labs. So this notion that math is somehow needs to be decolonized goes way beyond what you've been talking about. There's also in Canada, where I now live, the government funded a big program to decolonize light, which I think again is worth talking about here because of Faraday and Maxwell, because that's the problem. Electromagnetism was determined by Faraday. Well, resulted from the work of Faraday and Maxwell, and that therefore the whole theory of electromagnetism should be reconsidered. And also the problem, and this is part of the other problem, is the inherent racism that's in this supposed anti-racism, this decolonizing, automatically has a kind of racist undertone. Because they say, for example, in this decolonizing light thing, that physics is problematic because it's hard. And in order to be made accessible to indigenous people, we should get rid of the mathematics. But of course, that's racist. And decolonizing mathematics is racist too, don't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I haven't managed to give a sort of a full flavour of the literature. And one thing I've missed out in what I just described was the African literature on decolonizing maths is a bit distinct. The people who are writing about it are sort of half involved in it and half committed. There's this political pressure in Africa that you must do this. But they talk about the reactions of the teachers in their classes, and it's obvious that the people they're telling they must decolonize the curriculum are just there, putting their hands in the air. You know, they can't think of anything other than measuring the volume of a mud hut. And they realize it's insulting, and they want to get away from this nonsense and teach their students. If we were really committed to improving the situation for racial minorities in mathematics, what we have to do is improve the quality of mathematics teaching in Africa. It's very simple. There's another very simple thing we can do, which is provide textbooks free in Africa. That's what we will be doing, rather than just pointless intellectual posturing in UK universities and making up nonsense history.
I'll ask you to answer, and then maybe other people in different contexts later, but you notice some laughter in the audience. How can one account for the fact that the public understands this as nonsense, but not academics?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer is the George Orwell quote about only very smart people, but I think that's not it really, because I don't think not any, but barely any of the mathematicians I know believe a word of this. But they just simply don't speak out. And I think that it's that pressure within universities that everyone just wants to keep their head down and nobody dares talk about this. I get a lot, I mean, what I'm saying is pathetically mild, isn't it? But I get a lot of flack for it, and my colleagues daren't do it, and I think it's fair.
And that's a key point. I think people need to speak out, and the public needs to know about this. It's I always say, one of my favorite expressions is, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And as an educator, I tend to think that that's the case. But to speak out, and that's one of the purposes of the book, to get people, I think if the public learns how ridiculous this is, there'll be pressure on universities in ways that may eventually get to the heads of universities and give them some backbone. Now, Alan Sokal, I would say you're the granddaddy of understanding the dangers of postmodernist thinking in terms of knowledge and reason. And I called you a mathematician, although really you're a physicist like me, but you're now in the math department here. Before we get to, I have to ask you, before we get to the content of your piece, which is really about the incursion of ideology in science, and in particular this Nature article, this Nature editorial, I wanted to ask you the question, did you really, so in 1996, made fun of it, did you really think, did you ever imagine it could happen in science?
No.
Okay, well, that's a quick answer. Let's talk about this other issue that is really the subject of your piece, which is this Nature editorial, giving new ethics guidelines concerning proposed submissions, and what you see as problematic with it. So why don't you go ahead?
Right. Well, first of all, I'm glad that I was seated on the far left.
Okay. I'm a centrist myself.
So just before I answer your question, I'll be like a politician and just, answer my own question. So I just wanted to stress what I think Lawrence said at the beginning. There are two wars of science wars against science going on. The lesser one that we wrote about a year ago, and unfortunately a much more serious war on science that has started from the Trump administration after our book was published. Much more serious because it's using the power of the state. And so it's a little bit embarrassing. I mean, this has been used by our detractors to put down the whole book. I think the two wars on science are not unrelated, unfortunately. The war from the so-called left, and I say so-called because it has nothing to do with the left that I belong to. The war from the so-called left is not just on science, but on free thought in the universities and in society in general, I think is one of the many causes of the popular reaction that brought people like Trump to power and which causes a significant fraction of the electorate to approve his attacks on the universities, his attacks on free speech, his attacks on immigrants. So I just want to say that.
Let me jump in for a second, because I was worried I was going too long and I wanted to mention that, so I'm glad you brought it up. And I don't know, I assume people here are aware of it, but I also want to talk about it in relation to the book, and there's been a big reaction. How can you talk about this war on science when there is an explicit war on science that's happening in the United States? And it's largely in response to what we're talking about. The assumption is because there's some nonsense, all of science, or at least all of the scientific infrastructure, and all scientists are woke, if you want to use that term. And the administration is attacking it with a sledgehammer rather than a scalpel. And so they're attacking institutions, getting rid of major government-funded science programs that are essential to the scientific infrastructure of the country. Getting major scientists, I have many colleagues of mine, say at Harvard, who have been funded, distinguished scientists, who for the first time in 40 years have lost funding. And when you lose funding, it's not something next year can be restored, because the funding goes to support postdocs who come, if they're allowed, from other countries often, and students and graduate students. And when that funding goes, they lose their jobs, and those students go away, and the lab closes down, and it literally is destabilizing the scientific infrastructure of the United States. And the efforts to say that, again, National Science Foundation funds woke science, so we'll reduce the funding by 70%. All major programs, including LIGO, which won a Nobel Prize, being cut down. Getting rid of government scientists from all government commissions, people who know what they're doing. And the idea, you see, I remember, I was a little embarrassed, I wrote a piece. Initially, one of the first executive orders that Trump did was about DEI, about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is this kind of, which sounds good, but is undermining scholarship, as we'll talk about. I think Amy's going to talk about it in a minute. But you don't fight intolerance with intolerance. And so the idea is, well, they want to forbid it, but now you're not allowed to even talk about it. And as many people have pointed out, the way to get rid of bad ideas is to talk about them. And so it is a real problem. But it is a problem that needs to be dealt with at the ballot box, in legislatures, and among the public. The problem we're talking about is much more pervasive. And it's not gone away. It's not irrelevant because of the other thing. It's a culture war. And it's a culture war that's now dominating academic institutions. And the only way to try and, it's a much longer process to try and win that war, because you've got generations of people who are being brought up into this. And that's why we need to talk about it, and we need to try and make sure that academic institutions don't undermine themselves. So the two wars are happening. But one, and unfortunately, as you point out, the war that's happening from the government in the United States is in direct response to what they're seeing in the kind of nonsense that we're seeing here, and the assumption that therefore the whole field is bad, when in fact most scientists have kept their nose to the grindstone and just gone about their science. And there is a diversity of opinion about this. Neil Ferguson, who wrote a piece in our thing, thinks that in some sense we deserve it now because we didn't speak out. I think Schadenfreude doesn't matter. I think it is true that much of the scientific community didn't speak out, but maybe now is the time to speak out. Anyway, so I'm glad you brought it up, and it gave me a chance to add those words. Now back to nature.
Okay, so with that digression, back to your question. So Lawrence and John already briefly alluded to this editorial in Nature, and this was the subject of my article. So it happened 3 years ago. It was an ethics guidance concerning proposed submissions to Nature, but it didn't concern protection of human research subjects. I mean, that was regulated for decades. It didn't concern publishing information that poses serious material dangers. I don't know, information on how to produce nuclear or biological weapons. It wasn't about that. It was about other forms of harm that could be caused by a scientific publication. And let me read what the ethics guidance says. The editors arrogate to themselves this power. They say, regardless of content type, review, research, or opinion, and for research, regardless of whether a research project was reviewed and approved by an appropriate ethics committee, editors reserve the right to request modifications to, or correct or otherwise amend post-publication, and in severe cases, refuse publication of or retract post-publication. Okay, that's all the lawyerly stuff. Now let's get to the content. Content that undermines or could reasonably be perceived to undermine the rights and dignities of an individual or human group on the basis of socially constructed or socially relevant human groupings. So it's very vague and subjective. And so they don't even disguise that they're proposing to censor scientific contributions that are true on these social grounds. And so they're a little more precise about what kind of harms they're trying to protect against. And they say, for example, research may inadvertently stigmatize individuals or human groups. It may be discriminatory, racist, sexist, ableist, or homophobic. It may provide justification for undermining the human rights of specific groups simply because of their social characteristics. So my article was basically an attempt to go through one by one these sentences and try to unpack what it could mean. So first of all, what could it mean for scientific research to stigmatize individuals or human groups, and to do so inadvertently? Well, for example, suppose that research finds that obesity can cause cancer. Well, it can. Does that stigmatize overweight people? Well, some people would argue that it does, but that's shooting the messenger because we don't like the message. Suppressing this research would, above all, harm overweight people by denying them information that they could use if they want, and only if they want, to protect their health. Or suppose that research finds that gay men have more sexual partners on average than heterosexual men. Well, they do. There are lots of surveys that show that. Does that stigmatize gay men? Well, maybe it does in the eyes of people who don't like sexual promiscuity, but it also is important information for planning interventions to reduce the risk of sexually transmitted disease, and those are interventions that would disproportionately benefit gay men. And so the editors of Nature have assigned to themselves this purely subjective task of judging which research stigmatizes some social group, and then are empowering themselves to suppress it, even though it's likely to be true and important. Okay, now, what does it mean for scientific research to be discriminatory, racist, sexist, ableist, or homophobic? Well, if research incorporated racist or sexist presuppositions, then that would be a scientific defect that would undermine the quality of research and maybe invalidate it entirely, purely on traditional scientific criteria. You don't need any new ethics guidance on that. What the editors are getting at clearly is not racist or sexist presuppositions, but conclusions from the research that they think in their infinite wisdom are racist or sexist. But again, that's shooting the messenger. And then finally, what does it mean to provide justification for undermining the human rights of specific groups? Well, how could research is scientific research gives you facts about reality. It doesn't undermine in and of itself anybody's rights. What they seem to have in mind is research that some people might attempt to misuse as a supposed justification for undermining human rights. But if that's the case, you should criticize the misuses of the research, not suppress the valid research. But then the editors are very, very careful. They don't say just research that undermines the rights and dignities of an individual human group. They say research that undermines or could reasonably be perceived to undermine the rights and dignities of an individual group. So it doesn't have to actually undermine anybody's rights and dignities. People just have to perceive it that way. Well, the trouble is, just about any scientific research that has public policy implications is likely to be controversial, and somebody will perceive it to undermine somebody's rights and dignities. For example, so now I'm not inventing this example, imagine an article reviewing the neuropsychological effects of puberty blockers. That will likely be labeled by advocates of gender identity ideology as undermining the rights and dignities of transgender people. In fact, that article was criticized that way by one of the reviewers. But then other people and the author will reply, this research helps to protect the rights of gender nonconforming teenagers by offering them accurate information about the benefits and risks of proposed medical interventions. But then again, the editors are very careful. They say research that could reasonably be perceived to undermine. But who gets to decide which perceptions are reasonable and which not? The editors, of course. So I just want to conclude by quoting one perceptive comment on this by Bo Weingard. He's a very controversial psychologist, and I probably don't agree with a lot of the things he said about other issues. But he said something very perceptive about this nature ethics guidance. He said, imagine for a moment that this editorial were written not by political progressives, but by conservative Catholics, who announced that any research promoting, even inadvertently, promiscuous sex, the breakdown of the nuclear family, agnosticism, or atheism would be suppressed and rejected, lest it inflict unspecified harm on vaguely defined groups or individuals. Many of those presently nodding along with nature's editors would have no difficulty identifying the subordination of science to a political agenda. And so I think what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander.
Good, thank you very much. So, and just, Nature is a journal that comes from the UK, and I do want to just point out that I wanted to read the Royal Society of Chemistry, which actually I think goes one step further than Nature. So they set a set of guidelines to their editors about the risk of publishing inappropriate or otherwise offensive content. And it says, offense is a subjective matter, and sensitivity to it spans a considerable range. However, we bear in mind that it's the perception of the recipient we should consider, regardless of the author's intention. And then they say, or you might say, okay,
This is in chemistry.
yeah, this is the Royal Society of Chemistry. And then, lest you might wonder, it says, please consider whether or not any content might have potential to cause offense, okay, referring to the guidelines. And here are the guidelines of how to cause offense. Any content that could reasonably offend someone on the basis of their age, gender, race, sexual orientation, religious or political beliefs, marital or parental status, physical features, national origin, social status, or disability. Okay, it's pretty hard not to find something that's going to offend one of those people. But any of that should now not be published in the.
I can well imagine lots of articles on chemistry that would offend people on those lines.
Yes. Let me one last question, then we'll go to Amy, and then I want to actually ask Toby a question, and then turn to the panel for a few minutes. Okay, before we get to the public, I'm thinking maybe 5 or 10 more minutes before we go to questions.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things you point out is the document states ominously. And you say the document, the Nature article, and I might ask anyone here to comment on this as well. It says, although academic freedom is fundamental, it is not unbounded. What does that mean?
Well, this is the typical thing that people who want to attack freedom of speech or academic freedom say. They say it's not unbounded, it's not unlimited, it's not it's not unlimited. And then they don't say what they intend to suppress. And they don't give arguments for why it should be, why that suppression would do more good than harm. They simply make the abstract proposition and then imagine that then they can draw whatever consequences they want from it.
It seems to me a very ominous statement in general, and I want to go to Amy next. But does anyone else have any comment? And I know Amy's thought about this. We'll tell you what. Why don't since we're going to go to you next,
I could comment on that
Why don't
just
you- why
from
don't
an
you
American point of view.
Yeah, sure.
That is a phrase that I hear, statement I hear a lot. But the nice thing about being American is that we have the First Amendment of the Constitution to protect us. And we have a Supreme Court that has taken the First Amendment very seriously. The Supreme Court agrees that free speech is not unlimited, but then it has defined very precise categories where free speech is to be curtailed. So, imminent threat of harm, libel, fraud, that sort of thing, not just these vague statements that, fill in the blanks. And I think that is what the left is not doing here. It's not giving us the precise boundaries of the limitations.
Absolutely, and those limitations keep increasing, as we'll talk about, and in almost a religious sense, almost a heretical sense.
Can I jump in and ask?
Well, I was going to ask you. You can jump in now. I was basically going to. Well, let me give you the question anyway. If you're going to jump in, first of all, I want to thank the Free Speech Union for putting this on. The Free Speech Union in this country is incredibly important, and I'm very honored to now be affiliated with it. And I wanted to thank you for that. And I will add that my foundation is also a supporter of this event, the Origins Project Foundation. But I was, and in that context, I wanted to ask, and maybe your response to that question will be involved in this. Why, in particular, what is it about what we're talking about that you think is particularly relevant for the Free Speech Union, and why are you doing it?
I will come to that, but something occurred to me listening to Alan and contrasting it with some of the things that John said. It seems to me that we can distinguish between two different warfare tactics that the left is deploying. What John
Left in quotation marks.
Left in quotation marks. What John was describing was, and what others have alluded to too, including you, Lawrence, and Richard, was one attempt to deal with inconvenient scientific or mathematical truths is to attack the very concept of scientific truth itself and to claim that it is just one particular Western, rationalist, European point of view. And we've been, that's been pretty pervasive over the last 25, 30 years as an attack on science. The very notion of truth and objectivity, it's all tied up with Western privilege. This is a slightly different sort of attack, isn't it, Alan? It's saying, okay, these inconvenient facts, these inconvenient conclusions researchers have come to may very well be true. We just want to censor them because they pose such a challenge to our radical progressive outlook agenda. And in some sense, is the Nature editorial then progress? Are they saying, okay, we're not going to go so far as to say there are many different truths and we shouldn't prioritize the Western European rational scientific truth over indigenous ways of knowing or whatever. We're acknowledging that there is a superior method to arriving at the truth, which is a hell of a concession. And we're also acknowledging that some of the conclusions that this method produces are inconsistent with our progressive outlook. I mean, it's a hell of a concession to the reality-based community, isn't it? I mean, it feels a bit like progress, ghastly though it is.
Well, yeah. I mean, the first part, I think it would be very unlikely that a major scientific journal would openly adopt a postmodernist attitude towards truth.
Oh, hold on there. I think you may not have believed in 1996 it happened, but it's happened. There are major scientific journals. I gave you the American Physical Society journal on whiteness as a.
But that was one article. Which was very heavily criticized. But what I'm talking about is a journal adopting a scientific journal adopting as its policy the idea that there is no objective scientific truth, or even going part way in that direction, I think would be unlikely. What they've done, however, they don't explicitly say, we will censor articles that violate our harm criteria, even though they're true, right? That would be too embarrassing for them to say that. That is what they're saying, but they don't put the even though they're true into it.
Well, the editor of Nature Behavior actually put the even though they're true in her statement, in her defense of the Nature editorial. She specifically said things that are true, if they may cause harm, should not be published. And I think, I mean that,
just to defend a little bit, that is a defensible position if we're talking about things that are true, like the DNA sequences of potential biological weapons. But that's not what this Nature editorial is about.
And that comes to what Amy's going to talk about. I'm going to go to the.
To jump in here, I think that a very clever, sneaky, nasty trick that the left has played on us is to.
Marks again.
There's a disagreement between the two authors here, I think, but go on.
Subjectivize the harm principle.
Yeah.
So we have John Stuart Mill with his harm principle that we should be allowed to do things and say things unless they are harmful to others. And what the left has done is said, aha, but there's psychological harm, there's subjective harm. And of course, the principle of subjective harm and psychological harm sort of eats the whole space of free expression. It destroys it. It's a nuclear option. And it's very hard to counter. I mean, I could talk about ways to counter it perhaps, but it's difficult.
We may get there. And I should say, this is perhaps where, and I'm not, you already said what you were going to say, Toby, but this is where it juxtaposes, I think, most closely with the problem of free speech. The whole point, as anyone who talks about free speech would say, is that the speech you want to protect is a speech you disagree with or that you don't like. And if this is exactly more or less saying that speech should be suppressed, and that's exactly against the principle of free speech. It's important, and as I first learned it from Christopher Hitchens, but I hear it goes back to Hume and others, that more important than protecting the speech you don't like is the fact that it infringes on your own rights, because if you suppress that speech, you don't have the right to learn that you're wrong. And that's the real problem. And that's why I think this is particularly appropriate to talk about now.
I just want to add.
I want to give Amy a chance. Go ahead.
Can I just add? I mean, that idea goes back to John Stuart Mill, and so in my article I quoted it precisely for this reason. So he says, "The peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race. Those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they're deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what's almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error." And so I think that's the key thing. We really need to preserve the ideas of the people who disagree with us, to keep us honest.
And in fact, Amy is going to go there. I think that's the heart of science. People don't realize science is a social construct. Jonathan Rauch has written about this a lot. It's a dialectic. Science cannot be done by one person. The ideas have to be attacked. That's the very basis of science, because only then will you find out what works. And Amy, although she's a distinguished professor of law, has written an article with her husband, Roger Cohen, and it's about basically trying to treat medicine as science. In certain areas of medicine, it's treated scientifically, but clearly in the area of DEI, it isn't. So why don't you have a chance to chat about that?
Thank you very much for inviting me here. I do want to just comment on what you just said. I'm going to do a shout out to our own United States Supreme Court, which has articulated the concept of a heckler's veto. That is the veto of someone who's offended by what you say. That veto, it should not be allowed to shut down speech, and the Supreme Court has said that multiple times, and they have never retreated from that position. Hooray. Okay. Now on to our article on DEI in medicine. What was the inspiration for this article? I wrote it with my husband, Dr. Roger Cohen, who is a professor of medicine at Penn Med School. He's been there for decades. He's an oncologist, that is, he treats cancer, and he has been the dean for clinical trials in cancer there for a number of years. My husband's day-to-day job is to develop new therapies, new treatments, new drugs and protocols for improving outcomes in cancer. And in order to propose and get approval for new treatments in cancer, and this is not just true about cancer, this is true about any area of medicine, it is necessary to jump through a series of extremely rigorous hoops of demonstrating that there is benefit, there is upside to the new therapies and new methods that one is proposing. And this is mandated not just by government regulation, the FDA, but also by basic fundamental principles of American and Western medicine and science, which says data, proof, proven value, benefit, that is what we must demonstrate in order to adopt new therapies, and everybody benefits from that. Everybody in this room is someday going to be a patient. You may not be interested in medicine, but medicine is interested in you. Now, what about our article? It turns out that American medicine and American academic medicine has been revolutionized over the past 10 years or so. The priority, and I don't exaggerate here, is no longer curing disease, improving health, improving outcomes, saving lives. The priority has become DEI, diversity, inclusion, and equity. And once again, it's taken over our medical schools. That is the most important thing. Until recently, until the Trump administration came in, and still to a large extent, A large part of the academic medical establishment in the United States is devoted to DEI, promulgating the priorities of diversity, equity, and inclusion, advancing those priorities, doing research on so-called disparities. And of course, the focus here is on race, because the entire motivation is that in American society, up until this point, and perhaps indefinitely in the future, we do not have group equality. Blacks and Hispanics especially lag behind in academic achievement, lag behind in health, wealth, and various other parameters. How has this affected academic medicine in the United States? It has changed the way students are admitted to medical school, the way that they are evaluated and assessed once they get there. They're hiring into residency programs, into fellowships, the ways that grant money is allocated, the criteria that are used, the way people are treated, the research that is done. It's been a comprehensive transformation in the priorities that dominate American medicine, and especially academic medicine. Now, what's wrong with that? Sounds good. The problem is, unlike with other changes that are introduced in medical practice, there is no proof that any of these priorities, alterations, do any good for anybody. They have been entirely motivated by ideology. There is no believable research to back up that DEI priorities make anybody better, improve health, prolong life, or anything of the sort. Now, the fact is, there are a lot of claims that are made, and in our chapter, we review the main studies that are trotted out on this sort of, during this project, which is countrywide, of advancing DEI priorities, and we debunk these main studies and show that they are effectively worthless. And I will just talk briefly about two of them. Of course, there are a lot of details here. There's a lot of scientific technicalities, but I will simplify them. One of the main studies that's relied on is the so-called Florida Infant Concordance Study. It looks at over 1 million babies born in Florida and asks the following question: if a baby is taken care of by a Black doctor and the baby is Black, does that baby do better in outcomes, in health, in morbidity and mortality than if the baby is taken care of by a white doctor? The study claims that the answer there is yes, Black babies do better when taken care of by Black doctors than white doctors. Now, that study, which is cited repeatedly, and I mean over and over and over again by the DEI proponents, and there are whole bureaucracies of them, is absolutely worthless. It has recently been definitively debunked. What's the problem? The authors of the study forgot to control for the baby's birth weight. It turns out that babies that are low birth weight, who have a higher incidence of premature death and disease, are disproportionately taken care of by white doctors. Why is that? Because white doctors dominate in the tertiary care centers, the university care centers, where these babies are cared for. Once you control for birth weight, the concordance result disappears. And this has been shown now by a number of analysts. Doesn't matter, the study keeps getting cited. It keeps getting touted. The second study is the so-called Oakland study of Black men. What happened in that study? That involved about 1,300 individuals. These public health types went out to barbershops and street fairs with an iPad and asked Black men, random samplings, a series of questions. They said, if you had a Black doctor tell you to take your diabetes pills and reduce your consumption of alcohol and do all these healthy things, would you be likely to do those things? Then they asked them, if you had a white doctor or an Asian doctor that asked you to take all of these steps, would you take these steps? And what they found is that the Black men were more likely to listen to Black doctors than white doctors. Now, what do they conclude from that? This is all just hypothetical. This is a series of questions. No studies on whether they actually did these things, whether they actually had better health, no outcome measures, nothing of the sort. The discussion section said, this proves that Black doctors improve the health of Black men. Of course, it shows nothing of the sort. It demonstrates no such thing. So this is really the sum total of the scientific basis for the benefits of DEI. Now, what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with the picture is that the rigorous standards of proof, of data, of demonstration that we apply and have applied for decades, indeed hundreds of years, in other areas of medical practice and medical science, to the benefit of all of us, are not applied in this area of DEI and this transformation of medicine and academic medicine into a very different animal, not of cure, not of benefit, not of health, but essentially of feel-good, virtue-signaling ideology. And this is something that should not occur. If DEI is going to become the main priority of medicine, and especially academic medicine, then it ought to be held to the same standard as the rest of medical science. The United States today is the cutting-edge leader in medical innovation, in cancer medicine, in all of the wonderful advances and developments that have led to palpable benefit for innumerable people. And really, we have a situation now where diagnoses that used to be a death sentence, lung cancer, for instance, where your doctor would say, get your affairs in order, because in a year you'll be dead. Now we have individuals who are 5, 10 years out or longer, who see their children graduate, who see their grandchildren be born. And that is something that we should not jeopardize and we should not sacrifice for ideological and political correctness. Thank you.
Very well done.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. Before I turn this over to Toby, who has some questions to the audience, I just want to add one thing by quoting another author in the piece, Sally Sattel, who points out that not only can it not necessarily help, but it can be harmful. And the example she gave, which is kind of scary, had to do with COVID treatment, where it was the initial thought was that the first priority should go to elderly people in a major hospital study, but it turned out that there were more white elderly people than Black elderly people. So they decided instead of a first priority going to elderly people, it should go to people of color. And that, obviously that hurts elderly people. That kind of ridiculous identity imposition is actually not just not good, it's actually bad for health. The other thing I want to point out is that it's not, again, just a unique American problem. And again, in my own country, CanMeds, which is the major study of medical education in Canada, said a new model of CanMeds, listen to this, would seek to center values such as anti-oppression, anti-racism, and social justice rather than medical expertise. You got to ask if you want to go to a doctor who's got a good sense of social justice rather than knowing how to be a doctor. And as Sally said in the end of her piece, the best way to be an anti-racist doctor is to be a good doctor. And okay, so thank you for all of the panelists. I'm going to turn to Toby, who has some questions from the audience.
Thank you. Well, we have a few questions from the audience. One of the best questions I've got in front of me is as follows. From someone training to become a science teacher who's struck by how charged and sometimes polarized the classroom and even teacher training can feel around certain topics, do you have any advice on how to help young students develop genuine critical thinking skills, encouraging curiosity and evidence-based reasoning without it feeling like I'm pushing a political stance? Did you have any thoughts about that, Richard? Any advice for a young trainee science teacher about how she can encourage her students to develop genuine critical thinking skills, curiosity, evidence-based reasoning, without being accused of pushing a kind of contentious political point of view just by advocating those things?
A very difficult problem is that much of the pressure for all this nonsense comes from young people. And my suspicion is that whenever you hear an otherwise sensible scientist talking nonsense, cherchez les enfants. And so there will be peer pressure from the young teacher trainee, from people of her own age. And that's a big problem. I can only say, be true to objective truth.
I'm going to jump in and say, you should teach science. Because that's the way science works. That's the whole purpose. Science is based on the fact that people like to delude themselves. So the scientific process is based on questioning and testing and retesting and finding you're wrong. And so I think the best thing you can do, and that's how scientists get trained, to second guess their own results and to not, we all have biases, but the process overcomes those biases. That's what makes science useful. It's not as if scientists themselves don't have biases. The process weeds it out by arguments and debates. So the best thing I think the teacher can do is teach the scientific process by example to show how bad ideas have been weeded out, et cetera. And so I think the best thing that they can do is really what they're supposed to do, which is teach science.
Can I just add that?
It's okay.
The first thing I would say to them is, facts don't care about your feelings. That's just a basic concept that they need to get through their head. The second is, and I think this isn't emphasized enough because it's thought to be politicized and it steps on people's toes, the glorious benefits, very concrete, and we can, go into excruciating detail on this, of the advances generated by the scientific method, by sticking to these methodologies and what they have delivered, the deliverables for us, and just very concretely point them out. I think people take these things for granted. There is a lot of ingratitude out there for what we have achieved.
Yeah, I just want to second what Lawrence said about the importance of teaching about the scientific process, the scientific ethos, because, so much of science teaching, unfortunately, is almost like catechism, right? They teach the facts which scientists have discovered and not the reasons why scientists now believe them. So, for example, just go to any university campus and ask people, do you believe that matter is made of atoms? And I'm sure 95% of the people will say yes. But how many of those would actually be able to give you a good reason why they believe it, other than the fact that their teacher told them?
Exactly.
And I should say, and these are things that can be explained at the high school level, but it takes a little bit of time to explain them.
And I think the other thing in the teaching process itself, and teachers, I talk to teachers a lot about this. You know, we used to teach facts, but now in my cell phone, there's more facts and misfacts than anyone. We should teach by questioning, asking questions, and be willing to say, I don't know. Let's find out. And that's a really good way to teach young people how to think and to question, why do you believe? Instead of saying matter is made of atoms, ask the question, why is matter? Why do you think matter is made of atoms? And that's the kind of, we should be teaching by questioning, I think, and being willing to not know the answer, which is really the most exciting thing about being a scientist.
So, another question inspired by one of the questions from the audience. You said earlier, Lawrence, that the fact that the Trump administration is defunding various scientific programs, institutions, is a direct consequence of the capture of science, perhaps not complete, but partial capture by the radical progressive left. Radical progressive left have said, science tells us that we ought to be left-wing. We ought to pursue DEI policies. Here's the scientific evidence. We ought to pursue net zero. It told us that we all needed to stay in our homes during the pandemic. We need to get vaccinated, et cetera, et cetera. It's enlisted by the progressive left in service of these progressive causes. So the response by the Trump administration is, oh, well, if science is telling people to be left-wing, if science is left-wing, let's defund it. So it's got kind of caught up in this destructive culture war. What hope do we have that it can escape this kind of destructive spiral and free speech, academic freedom can be restored to their rightful places, science can once again become depoliticized and placed in service of improving mankind, health, etc.? What reasons are there for hope?
Well, actually, it's good. I was going to ask the panel to some extent for that, and I should say the last part of the book it deals with what can we do about it. Ultimately, there has to be a commitment, in my opinion, by leading the people who run universities and run scientific institutions, that free inquiry is the hallmark of science, and that is what must be protected. And that is what is not done. Those people cave in to social mobs, to social media, because most university presidents they used to be intellectual leaders, now they're fundraisers, and they would rather avoid a bit of bad press than defend academic freedom. And I think, but ultimately, I think the way to do it, like everything else, is to speak out about these things, because when the public finds out, ultimately, I mean, leaders don't lead, they follow. And when the public finds out what's going on and are willing and concerned enough about it to not donate to universities that don't adhere to these rules, to elect people appropriately, I think that's the only way to do it. And of course, this phenomena on the left is not new. Politics have interfered with science for many years, and I used to talk about it on the right in the old days. And I think we just have to be brave enough to speak out, and that's why I'm so proud of the people on this stage.
I just want to add, in response to what Toby said, I have a slightly different analysis of how Trump's war on science is related to the so-called left's earlier war on science. I don't think it's a direct reaction. I mean, I think we're seeing two things. On the one hand, the Trump administration is directly attacking certain science that they don't like. Robert Kennedy attacking medical science, and the Trump administration in general attacking climate science. But then I think what the other thing that's happening is the Trump administration is attacking the universities, because the universities are a potential source of opposition. This is the same thing that Viktor Orban has done in Hungary, that Erdogan has done in Turkey. The universities have to be attacked because they're potential oppositions. And of course, the way of attacking the universities is financial. You use the pretext of anti-Semitism to withhold hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars of research funding. Who does that research funding hit? Well, it hits scientists, because that's where the big research funding is. So the scientists in this war are collateral damage.
Can I say something just about the UK situation, just going to the reasons for optimism that you asked about? One thing that's changed radically is that we now have the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which the Free Speech Union, I think, was very much involved in getting for us, and it's made a radical difference. So universities are changing their policies completely. For example, people were being required to commit to various statements about EDI in job interviews, and that's being taken out of people's job applications. We're seeing policies changed across the board. And for example, at my university, they literally put participating in Stonewall schemes in our promotion application. That was a couple of years ago. I just think that was astonishing. Well, that's gone. All that kind of politicization, promotion is gone. And that can only give people the confidence, well, increased confidence to speak out.
Yeah. I am not here to defend everything the Trump administration does, but I have to say this, that the universities today in the United States are a bastion of far left thought. Their tolerance of real dissent is virtually nil. I am currently suspended by my university for a year for CrimethInc, for expressing forbidden opinions, pure and simple. That is the reason that I am suspended and my salary has been cut. And the problem, of course, here is not even that there's ideological capture. It's that young minds are being poisoned by what is being taught in the universities today. This is a threat to the future of our country and the future of our republic. I am still inside the belly of the beast. I am a professor at an Ivy League university, and I'm sure they're sorry they didn't fire me. May still happen. But I see it every day. And the students that come to see me and talk to me, they describe it, chapter and verse, what they are taught in con law, what they are taught in criminal law, what they are taught every day in our law school. Far left propaganda. That is not right. That is, as I said, dangerous, and we are failing our young people by offering them a very expensive education of that sort.
Let me jump in before you. I want to echo that. I want to echo that in some sense, because I'm sure my politics are somewhat to the left of Amy's, but agreeing with that extreme concern, and I'll quote actually another author of Steve Pinker, who had pointed out, there are severe problems. There is rampant anti-Semitism at universities in the United States, and it's occurring. And he gave the example of Harvard, where it is where you're taken to task if you misgender someone at that time, but you're not taken to task if you say kill all the Jews. And somehow misgendering is taken to be more serious. And that is a real problem, and it's a real problem we have to, especially people on the left, have to admit exists. And as a cause for some hope, at Harvard, which scored lowest in the nation in the FIRE ranking of free speech, the Foundation for Research and for FIRE, whatever. It's for free speech and education, basically. Harvard scored lowest. There's now a council on free speech and academic integrity, which Steve Pinker and the former dean of the medical school are part of. So these things are happening, but we've got to accept. Yeah. But we've got to accept that there are real problems, and we can't. But my concern is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You got to attack the problems, not the whole thing. But anyway.
Alice, do you want to go?
Yeah, oh, sorry, Alice, go ahead.
I just wanted to say something that I hope we can all agree on, which is that it's so important that academics and scientists are a trusted voice in the face of all this post-truth, post-science thinking. So it is absolutely terrifying when Donald Trump says that paracetamol causes autism. I mean, it's absurd, it's idiotic, it's crazy. And it's just as crazy as it was when, for example, David Lammy said that a man can grow a cervix. And we have lost trust, I think, not because most academics believe in any of this nonsense, but because, as Lawrence has been saying, most academics just haven't stood up and said, actually, you know what, this is crazy. And it's now, I think, what's happening in the US should be a massive wake-up call that we should not be hunkering down and getting defensive and setting ourselves up as left versus right. Science is not left or right. It's a universal value, and we all need to work across the aisle on this. And yeah.
Thank you.
I think we'll end on that note because I don't want to deprive you of the opportunity to get copies of the book signed. If you have your copies, Lawrence and Richard will be up on stage here shortly, and everyone else will be up on stage in the other auditorium, which is very nearby. And if you haven't already got a copy, picked one up, you can buy one in the foyer. But I'd like to thank our incredibly distinguished panelists. I hope you'll join me in giving them a big round of applause. John, Alice, Richard, Lawrence, Amy, and Alan.